I am joined by Dave Caraffino of the Michigan DNR Fisheries Division Tribal Unit, and we're here to talk about the Great Lakes Consent Decree that was recently, I guess you would say it's been updated, and it's been recently, very recently, signed by the U.S. federal judge. I guess first, yes, tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do for the Michigan DNR.
Sure. So I manage the Tribal Coordination Unit. Our unit is a specialized unit within Fisheries Division that has the responsibility for implementing both formal and informal agreements that we have with tribal governments throughout the state.
Okay. And like I said, we're talking about the consent decree. So this was recently passed and it replaces the 2000 consent decree, right?
That is correct, yep. The
Okay.
2000 consent decree was originally slated to expire in the year 2020, but it took the parties a number of extra years to get through all the negotiations and then get through all the court proceedings. The technical name of this now is the 2023 Great Lakes Fishing Decree.
Oh, okay.
Judge Maloney termed it that. So
Okay.
that's kind of what we're trying to go with, or just 2023 Decree.
Okay.
So it's going to take all of us years to get rid of consent because we've been
Right.
saying that for 23 years. But that if we say consent decree, Sioux Tribe did not consent. And so we're kind of in that awkward situation of trying to get the lingo right. We don't want to be offensive to them because they didn't agree to this, but it's just sort of a touchy issue there. So.
Okay, I understand. So the decree, let's go back into the history. How and why has this ever come about, and what is the decree?
Sure. So back in 1979 was the first U.S. District Court decision that related to tribal fishing in the Great Lakes. Judge Noel Fox at that time reaffirmed the tribal right to fish. The tribes retained the right to fish in the Great Lakes in the 1836 treaty territory when they signed that treaty. So after Judge Fox's decision, there was another series of court decisions in 1981, and ultimately in 1985 was the first, what was called a decree at the time, where Judge Enslin had adopted one of the agreements that parties had made, and that was really what started sort of the rules by which the state, the tribes, and the federal government would co-manage the Great Lakes. That agreement was in place until the year 2000. And the parties at that time in 1998, 1999 came together to renegotiate a new set of rules. And that was 5 tribal governments, the U.S. federal government, and the state of Michigan. They all agreed to the 2000 consent decree. That was in place through 2020. Judge Maloney extended that numerous times because the parties needed more time to negotiate. We had a pandemic thrown in there, which kind of threw us for a loop as well. And we've seen some dramatic changes in the Great Lakes, which led to some very challenging negotiations. But ultimately, we had a proposed decree sent to Judge Maloney in December of 22. All parties agreed to that except for the Sioux Tribe. So we had 6 out of 7 parties in agreement. And then Judge Maloney outlined a court process that we followed for about 9 months until ultimately he signed what was the proposed decree into effect as the new decree. And so on August 24th, he signed into effect what he termed the 2023 Great Lakes Fishing Decree. We probably will refer to it as the 2023 Decree for short, because that's not as much of a mouthful.
Right, it is a mouthful. So I have a bunch of questions, but I guess first, so the Sioux Tribe is no longer a part of the decree, and how does that work? With fisheries management and them commercial fishing. And
Sioux Tribe is still a part of the decree. So it was ordered into effect by the judge, and it applies to all parties. So it still does cover the Sioux Tribe. Even though they didn't agree that this was the best set of rules for co-management, ultimately the judge still signing it into effect did place them underneath that. So they still are required to follow the rules and regulations that are outlined in that decree.
Okay. So what are the rules, kind of in a nutshell, what are the rules and regulations that are within the decree?
So the decree has many different aspects to it. Obviously, it's very long, very detailed, but it outlines allocation of different fish species and what proportion of this species, for example, lake trout, what proportion will the tribes get and what proportion will the state recreational fishers get in different parts of the Great Lakes. It does the same thing for whitefish. What proportion of the whitefish will the tribal commercial fishery get and what proportion will the state commercial fishery get? It also outlines how harvest limits will be set for both of those 2 species. Those are the 2 most important species that focus on really the intersection of the 2 fisheries, the tribes primarily prefer to harvest whitefish, but they also harvest lake trout. The state recreational fishery in many places of the Great Lakes prefers to harvest salmon, but also harvests lake trout, of course, as kind of a secondary species. And then the state commercial fishery harvests whitefish where it still exists. So those are the main species, and the decree outlines how we calculate harvest limits and how we divide those harvest limits up.
Okay.
There's other provisions within the decree for other species. There's provisions for how we share data amongst the parties. There's provisions for law enforcement and how we can make sure that we follow the rules we have within the consent decree, and numerous other smaller things as well.
Okay. So this applies to mainly the native commercial fisheries. Is there non-native or non-tribal? Sorry, tribal and non-tribal. Is there non-tribal commercial?
There are, yes.
Oh, okay.
There are still state licensed commercial fishers
Okay.
in 1836 treaty waters. We have a state commercial fisher out of Marquette who fishes inside 1836. The boundary is the Chocolate River, just east of Marquette.
Okay.
So while they port in Marquette, they do travel east into 1836 waters and do fish some there. We also have state commercial fishers out of Munising. And then in Lake Michigan, we have state commercial fishers now in Leland and in Muskegon.
Okay. And they follow the same set of rules?
They do. The commercial fishing rules in the 2023 decree apply to state commercial fishers as well as tribal commercial fishers.
Okay, great. So what are some key differences, would you say, between the 2020 and the 2023?
Do you want to, so can I pause, do you want to just focus on Lake Superior? Because,
it's
northern Lake Michigan?
I'd
just
say it
kinda
would
UP
focus
stuff?
on, Lake Superior, since, this show is Upper Peninsula, and then
Sure.
obviously the little, Bay to Knock and stuff, I imagine, is within that.
It is,
Okay.
yep.
All right.
Yep.
So what are some differences from the 2000 to 2023 regarding Lake Superior?
So the biggest difference is there's going to be a little bit of a change in some of the areas that different gear can be used compared to the 2000 consent decree. So in the 2000 consent decree, areas west of Grand Island, just west of Munising, were open to trap net fishing only for tribal fishers. In the 2023 decree, the area west of Grand Island, west to the boundary of treaty waters, the Chocolate River, that area will be open to gill net usage by tribal commercial fishermen. There's a couple other things that have changed in Lake Superior as well. Munising Bay used to be open to tribal commercial fishers with gill nets. That is now going to be a closed commercial fishing zone. So Munising Bay was open, will now be closed. Also, the two offshore sites, Big Reef and Standard Rock, they're offshore reefs. They're kind of destination lake trout fisheries for recreational fishers. Those are now both going to be closed to commercial fishing. So those are kind of two unique areas that are reserved for recreational fishing per se.
Okay. Yes, and then Lake Michigan.
So in Lake Michigan, there's going to be some changes in the Bay to Knock area, both in Little Bay and in Big Bay. So first in Big Bay, on the commercial side of things, there's been a commercial gill net fishery in Big Bay to Knock since 2017. It's been small, it's been kind of research oriented. That was something that was conducted by the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians. They are now going to be able to license gill net fishers in Big Bay to Knock to fish up to 12,000 feet of gill net. And the Sioux tribe will have the same opportunity to license gill net fishers to fish up to 12,000 feet of net in Big Bay to Knock. So in Big Bay to Knock, though, there are depth restrictions for those gill nets. And the intent is to avoid any catch of walleye. So the depth restrictions are to allow tribal fishers to fish with their preferred gear type and to pursue their preferred species, which is whitefish. So the depth restrictions that are in place essentially means that there won't be any open water in the northern half of Big Bay to Knock. Most of the areas where those fishers will be pursuing whitefish will be further out into the northern parts of Green Bay. And then in Little Bay to Knock, it was closed to commercial fishing in the 2000 consent decree. It is still closed to commercial fishing in the 2023 decree, but there are some changes to the subsistence fishing regulations in Little Bay. So in Little Bay in the spring is a popular subsistence fishery for walleye. Tribal members pursue walleye.
Right.
That is now going to be quite a bit more restrictive than it was in the 2000 consent decree. Previously, fishers could use 300 feet of gill net per day. That's decreased to 100 feet of gill net per day. Previously, the limit was 100 pounds of fish per day. Now the limit is 20 fish per day. It's a little easier to count fish than it is to know how much weight you have in your possession. There's also now a permit system that's going to be in place. So a fisher will obtain a permit so that law enforcement will know who is supposed to be out fishing on which days, which will make enforcement of the regulations much easier than it was in the 2000 consent decree. There's also enhanced reporting requirements. So the state and the tribes and the federal government will have a much better understanding of what the take is during that spring subsistence fishery compared to what we had in the 2000 consent decree.
Okay. So for the subsistence fishing, were they required to report before?
They were required to report, but typically the data wasn't shared until about a year after the fact.
Okay.
So it was challenging to be in the loop early on to know kind of what that fishery was looking like in the spring.
Okay. So what all parties were involved, I guess, in the negotiations for the consent decree?
Not
the consent. I got to stop calling it the consent decree.
I know, it's going to be brutal for years we're going to do this. Yeah.
Right, so what all parties were involved in the negotiations for the new 2023 decree?
So there's 7 parties involved, the state of Michigan, the United States government, and then 5 individual tribal governments. So ultimately we got to a point where 6 out of the 7 governments agreed with the document that had been put together. Sioux Tribe was not in agreement and was in opposition. The document that we settled on that was proposed to the court was, in our minds, the best compromise document that we could get to. The situation in the Great Lakes has changed over the past 23 years. The resources are different, the fishing opportunities are different, and we had to apply lessons that we learned from the 2000 decree to the current situation to try to reach agreement.
Right.
And there's things in the document that the state is not thrilled with, there's things that the federal government is not thrilled with, there's things that the tribes are not thrilled with. But when you're in a compromise situation, in a negotiation, there's give and take. And ultimately that's the best situation that we could land in.
Now, groups that are involved with sport fishing and recreation fishing, did they have any involvement in this process and negotiations, and what was within this?
Sure, they did, yeah. So there were a couple of different groups. There was the Coalition to Protect Michigan Resources and the Beta Knot Great Lakes Sport Fishing Group. They both were amici in this case, which is a status that they have. It's kind of called a friend of the court, where they were allowed to sit in and participate with the state during caucuses and negotiations, so they could observe negotiations with all 7 parties. But then when we would break apart and discuss proposals, they would come with the state and we would have a dialogue back and forth about, does this make sense? Does that make sense? Where can we compromise here and there? And so they were a part of negotiations. Ultimately, there was some disagreements between the state and those groups about how to proceed in a couple of different instances. And they did petition the court to grant them party status, which would have allowed them to sit at the table as the 8th party as a part of these negotiations. The court ultimately denied that. They did appeal that ruling, and the appeal was also denied. So they did have a seat at the table to observe negotiations and discuss issues with the state. And we did meet with them and discuss items outside of formal negotiations as well. So they were involved as part of this process, but they had an opportunity to file objections to the decree as well, because ultimately there were things in that document that they did not agree with. And they filed their objections with the court, just like the Sioux Tribe filed objections with the court. And the court heard all of those objections. The 6 parties that were in favor of the decree provided responses and evidence in opposition to those objections that they had raised. Judge Maloney held a hearing about those, and then ultimately Judge Maloney decided to enter the decree as it was proposed to him in December of 22.
Okay. Interesting. So in talking to some folks that were part of the Charter Boat Fishing Association and everything, I guess one of their big things was the gill nets. What are gill nets versus trap nets, and why is there such the opposition that the recreational and sport fishers have, I guess, against gill nets?
Yeah, so the difference between a gill net and a trap net is a gill net has webbing that it's kind of shaped like a diamond when it's strung into the water, and the fish, it's almost invisible. It's usually made out of monofilament. So when a fish swims into it, it wedges itself into it, or it gets tangled and twisted up. In most cases, the fish end up dying when it's in the gill net, because it stops them from pumping oxygen across their gills, and so they can't survive. In a trap net, the fish swim into a large pot, and they eventually just kind of are trapped in there. They swim around because they're not very smart. A fisher can lift that up and then scoop them out, and keep the ones they want and discard the ones that they don't want.
Okay.
So that's the difference between the gear types. And some of the opposition to gill nets really stems back from a program that was in the 2000 consent decree known as the trap net conversion program.
Okay.
So in the 2000 consent decree, the state bought out state licensed commercial fishers in all of their gear, their boats, their trap nets, and provided those to tribal fishers with the promise that tribal fishers would then not fish a certain amount of gill net and would in turn start fishing with trap nets.
Okay.
So the reason that program worked in the 2000 consent decree is because whitefish were plentiful. And so tribal fishers could fish in places they hadn't fished before and retain whitefish, but then discard lake trout that were caught in those trap nets. Well, fast forward 23 years, the whitefish populations in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan in particular are dramatically lower than they were in the 2000 consent decree when we were negotiating for that agreement. So without whitefish, tribal fishers that fish with trap nets really have nothing to catch, nothing to keep. The reason it worked in 2000 is because it could keep whitefish in throwback lake trout. If now the only thing they catch is lake trout, if they kept all those lake trout, it would be no different than if they were fishing with gill nets, because the focus is really on the lake trout. The recreational fishers want to pursue lake trout, and if tribal fishers can't pursue whitefish, what else are they going to pursue? They're going to catch the lake trout. So the conflict there would come from competition for a limited resource lake trout.
Right.
So that's why that program wasn't continued in the 2023 decree, because what allowed it to be successful, abundance of whitefish, were not there anymore.
Right.
And legally, there was nothing in the 2000 consent decree that required that program to continue beyond the life of the 2000 consent decree.
Okay.
So it was never an option really to pursue that, because it wasn't viable given how things had changed in the lakes. So the other concerns about gill nets is that maybe there's a bycatch issue, that tribal fishers will be pursuing whitefish, but they will catch some other species, and that would be
Walleye and
the issue. Walleye, salmon, steelhead, brown trout, whatever it could be. So historically speaking, when gill nets were a bigger concern, and we did see some localized impacts back in the 70s and 80s, that was a period when there was really not regulation of the fishery the way that we have right now. We have harvest limits in place now for lake trout that are scientifically based. We have more advanced monitoring of our lake trout populations than we've ever had in the past. So we have complex population models that give us a really good idea of how many fish are in the lake, and we can estimate how many fish can we safely kill based on that. So there's a cap on the number of fish that can be caught via any gear, and whether a fish dies from a gill net or that fish dies from a trap net or however, it's still a dead fish. And if we flip back to 1979, how we started this conversation, Judge Noel Fox in his ruling basically said the state does not have the right to tell the tribes what gears they can use in order to harvest their fish. This original controversy was over the use of gill nets in the tribal commercial fishery. And it's very clear that the state cannot dictate to the tribes the gear that they use. So the tribes prefer to use gill nets because it's a traditional gear. It's less expensive, so the barrier to entry for a tribal commercial fisherman is lower. So that's their desired gear, and we have a harvest limit and an allocation. How are we to dictate what gear can or cannot be used? So that's ultimately kind of where this comes down to, is we now have a well-regulated fishery with safe harvest limits that are established, and we want to make sure that we sustain the fisheries in a way that they're available for future generations, and that's a shared goal that the tribes have and that the state has. So when we think about other species that are caught potentially in gill nets that might be discarded as bycatch, a lot of the data that we have as an agency and the federal government has and the tribes have collected really shows that when gill nets are fished in a way that they are targeting a particular species, whether it be whitefish or whether it be lake trout, that the amount of bycatch can be extraordinarily small. So it's not the concern that we sometimes hear about and that we sometimes see. There are strict limits on how much fish that are non-target species can be retained. So some species can't be sold. Steelhead cannot be sold. Northern pike can't be sold. Brown trout, smallmouth bass, brook trout. The list of species that can't be sold is fairly long. But those species have a daily allotment that could be retained for personal use by tribal commercial fishers. If they catch more than that daily allotment, they have to discard those fish. tribal commercial fishers do not want to discard dead fish. That's
I was going to say, if they
goes
discard
against
it would be a dead fish.
Exactly. It goes against their culture. Like, they don't want to waste resource. So why would you throw back dead fish? So you're not going to set your net in a location where you're going to catch a bunch of fish that you have no use for and that you can't retain. So that's one of the things that we kind of need to keep in mind, that the fishers they know what they're doing, right? I mean, recreational fishers know what they're doing when you're on the water. If you're a commercial fisherman, that's your livelihood. You know what you're doing.
You're knowing where those nets, well, where you're allowed to place them, but based on where you put your nets, what you're going to catch.
Exactly.
I mean, perch aren't really hanging out in the same place that lake trout are hanging out.
Exactly. And there's different gear types to pursue different species. So there are a couple of places where tribal commercial fishers can pursue salmon. In the northern part of Lake Huron near Nuns Creek, there's a popular salmon fishery there in the fall. In the 2000 consent decree, the state was required to stock Chinook salmon there for really a dual purpose, because recreational fishers catch those fish throughout the course of the season. Then when they return to that Nuns Creek area in the fall, it benefits the tribal commercial fishers. That commitment of stocking is unchanged in the 2023 decree. So there still will be a popular salmon fishery for tribal fishers as they return in the late summer and early fall. The gear types used to harvest those salmon are completely different than the gear types used to fish for lake trout or whitefish in deeper waters throughout other parts of the season. So the gear type, the location, the depth, all of that matters as to what you're actually going to catch. And tribal fishers are able to tailor their gear type, their depths, when and where, and all of that to the species that they're pursuing.
But I mean, either way, bycatch is inevitable. I mean, they are going to catch, some. And
it depends when, where, and what. But bycatch is of minimal concern.
Okay, good to know. As far as like the netting locations, I mean, those have changed, but I mean, is there like pinpoint? I was looking at and there's the decree, there's many pages, but I mean, there's like spots, like you can be here, but not like right here, and here, but not here.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things it's a big benefit now in the 2023 decree compared to the previous one, is that before we didn't have GPS coordinates marking a lot of these different boundaries, and that's one of the benefits now is throughout the decree. And there's also in one of the appendices to the decree is a lot of GPS coordinates to say exactly what you just said. This spot you can, this spot you can't. So recreational fishers who are commonly fishing in an area will probably just plug all that stuff into their GPS, and they'll know exactly where they should or should not be looking for different nets of different types. And that helps law enforcement, because if they get calls with complaints and people can report a GPS coordinate, it's super easy for law enforcement to know if that's in or out of a certain zone or a certain area. And it also benefits commercial fishers as well, because they need to know, can I set here or not? And is there going to be a gray space? They don't want to have to deal with unnecessary tickets, because in their opinion they were in a safe spot. In law enforcement's opinion, they were over the line as it relates to some point somewhere or something. So having GPS coordinates to define those boundaries is really going to help everybody.
And how was that determined, like those GPS boundaries? I mean,
they were all settled in negotiations. Okay. Yeah, so we would look at, for example, Rabbit Back Point to Bruley Point in northern Lake Huron is the boundary of a salmon zone. Well, how do you know if you're exactly off that point or a little bit south of that, or where? So now there's a defined coordinate that says at this line of latitude, this is considered off of Rabbit Back Point. So if you're south of that, you're out of the zone. If you're north of that, you're in the zone. All those things were discussed amongst all the parties.
Okay. And I guess as like a recreational fisherman, woman, angler, be like, well, this is it. There's good fishing right there. I don't know.
Well, yeah, it depends on the situation. I mean, there's a whole lot that goes into different zones and, why things are laid out the way they were. Some of those are history. Some of those are, different species that are in different areas. Some of it is different times of the year that maybe tribal commercial fishers would prefer to be in there in the fall. Recreational fishers tend to be in certain places more in the summer, because recreational fishing tends to take place largely more when the weather's nice. So there's a lot of different factors that impact how the zones get laid out and how the boundaries get defined.
So I guess we haven't really got into, there are harvest limits for whitefish, for lake trout, and then any walleye or salmon or bycatch.
Yep, just those two. Lake trout and whitefish are the only two that have specific harvest limits.
Okay.
Yep.
And are those the same, or have those changed since or from 2000?
Yep, so the whitefish harvest limits, the allocations are pretty much the same. The only difference is the state was allocated 10% of the quota in Big Bay to Knock as part of the 2000 consent decree. The state no longer has an allocation for whitefish in Big Bay to Knock, so that area is going to be exclusively a tribal commercial fishery now. And with regard to lake trout, the allocations are pretty much the same. There's a couple of changes in Northern Lake Huron. Management units MH1 and MH2, which are kind of divided by Rogers City there. To the north was MH1, to the south was MH2. Those are now combined for management purposes. MH1-2 is now together, which is a benefit for recreational anglers who have experienced some issues with the harvest limits in MH1 in the past. And the other area where there's some changes is in the western part of Lake Superior with regard to treaty waters anyway, western Lake Superior, so just east of Marquette. That area, the state previously had 95% of the allocation for lake trout. Now that's going to be 60% for the state. So the tribes will have an increased harvest limit in that area because of the gear usage change. So they will be allowed to fish with gill nets in that area now, and so they'll have a higher allocation for lake trout because they'll be having more fishing activity for them just east of Marquette in that range.
Now when you say the state's allocation, is that state allocation for state commercial fishermen or state and recreational?
Great question. So state commercial fishers can only pursue whitefish. That's the only species they're allowed to pursue. So the allocations and harvest limits for whitefish that the state has only applies to state commercial fishing. On the lake trout side of things, that's the state's allocation is for recreational fishing. So recreational fishers, charter captains, all of that, hook and line, that is where our allocation for lake trout goes.
Do charter boat captain, I mean, do they have to report how much, their clients and how much they're taking per day?
They do, yep. So charter captains have always had to report. They've had a monthly report that they've done since the inception of the charter boat reporting program in the early 1990s. The one change that will be coming to the charter boat program as a result of this decree is that charter captains will be reporting electronically, which they are now reporting electronically, but they will be doing it twice a month instead of once a month. And that is a change that reporting frequency is something that we're going to be seeing across the board in the decree. So that's going to apply to tribal commercial fishers, state commercial fishers, charter captains, as well as wholesale fish dealers. So all of those industries will be reporting on the same frequency using electronic reporting, and all of that data is automatically going to be shared amongst the state and the tribes and the federal government in real time. So as soon as that data is submitted into an electronic system, it's going to be available to the parties to use for management purposes.
I think that'd be really beneficial. I mean, going from 2000 to 2023, I mean, I'm just thinking, I graduated from high school in 2000. Technology has completely changed in 23 years regarding computers and digital and how fast you can just do things and create reports online digitally. Yeah,
the 2000 consent decree had paper-based monthly reporting. So someone would fill it out on a piece of paper, drop it off, mail it to their respective agency, who would then have to type it in, compile everything, and then send it off to all the other parties. And there were inaccuracies, it was slow, we didn't get information in real time, and so this will be a big improvement. And it will improve the quality of data that we use for management, which was ultimately one of our goals. So one of the main things that allowed the 2000 consent decree to be successful was something that most people probably never saw. And that was a committee structure that really held together the 2000 consent decree. And there was a modeling subcommittee, which was a group of biologists from the state, the tribes, and the federal government who came together to share data, analyze data, calculate population estimates from population models, and then do the behind-the-scenes work to produce harvest limits. That group then reported to another committee that had membership from all the tribes, the state, and the federal government called the Technical Fisheries Committee. That was more kind of a group of managers that discussed those harvest limits. They discussed stocking issues, assessment fishery issues, all kinds of things associated with those fisheries. They then reported into the Executive Council, which was leadership from all the tribes, the state, and the federal government. And then we also had another committee called the Law Enforcement Committee, where state law enforcement met with their counterparts in the tribes, the tribal law enforcement officers, and that improved communication. They conducted joint patrols, they shared information. That collective commitment by the tribes, the state, and the feds to come together to monitor the fisheries, to collect the data, to make sure they applied the consent decree the way that it was written, That allowed the 2000 consent decree to be successful. And that exact same structure and that exact same commitment is memorialized in the 2023 decree. So we've got great confidence that, while, yeah, there are some changes and there'll be some differences on the water here and there, but the management side of it and what we do behind the scenes to collect data, we'll be getting better data now. How we're going to manage the fishery is going to be improved compared to what we were doing in the 2000 consent decree. And the collective commitment to ensuring sustainable populations for generations to come is just as solid as it was in the 2000 consent decree.
Essentially, so the whitefish population is not good in Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron.
Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Lake Superior, it's still strong.
Still strong. Okay,
Yeah.
the whitefish population is still strong. Okay. So say Lake Michigan.
Do you want me to talk about that a little bit at all, or no?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that is the species that we're mainly talking about and targeting here, and the focus is on with the decree for the most part.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so the whitefish population in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron has seen tremendous declines since we signed the 2000 consent decree. Really, after 2010, we really started to see populations and harvest start to decline. That's because of the invasive species that we have in the lower lakes, the zebra mussels and now quagga mussels. They're kind of termed dracinid mussels in general. So with the increase in mussels, they've just completely changed the ecology in the lower food web of those two lakes. So whitefish populations now are 10 to 20% of what they were two decades ago.
That's a lot.
And with that species being the backbone of the tribal fishery, it introduces a lot of complexity to what does that fishery look like, what other species are available, what is going to happen with whitefish longer term. And there is a commitment in the 2023 decree by all parties to pursue stocking as a potential rehabilitation tool for whitefish. We don't know if that's going to work or if that's not going to work.
Right.
Little Traverse Bay bands and the Sioux Tribe have taken the lead on doing some preliminary research to see how do we rear whitefish and are there opportunities that we can pursue to try to use that as a tool to boost populations. All parties are going to be working with them to try to design a program to really test the feasibility of that. And if it works, great, and if it doesn't work, then we'll continue to look at other possibilities to recover that species. Thankfully, Lake Superior has not seen those same declines. Dracinid mussels do not survive well in Lake Superior. They are not prolific there like they are in the lower lakes. And the food web, well, certainly it's changed a bit over the decades. It's much more intact than what we've seen in the lower lakes. And we still have pretty strong populations of whitefish in Lake Superior.
Okay. So is that why, since the whitefish, has populations are not doing great in Michigan Huron, is that why lake trout is now being, I guess, more pursued as commercial?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Absolutely. So in the 2000 consent decree, lake trout was not a primary species. Right. I mean, at that time, lake trout were 30 cents a pound on the commercial market, and whitefish were $1.50 up to $2 a pound. I mean, it wasn't worth your time to try to pursue lake trout because economically whitefish were so much more valuable, and they remain much more valuable today. But with the disappearance of whitefish, then what's next,
left?
Right? And the value of lake trout has increased on the commercial markets because of that. And there's a lot of other products that lake trout are being turned into to make them more attractive as a commercial species. So that is a difference from 2000 to 2023 is lake trout are now pursued as a commercial species in many places, which is really not a whole lot different in terms of, well, if a fish is harvested as bycatch when you're targeting whitefish, or if it's pursued commercially as the target species, it's still capped by a harvest limit. And there's still a safe number of lake trout that can be taken on an annual basis from each management unit. And now we'll get better data. So we'll have a better understanding of how is the fishery progressing towards that harvest limit throughout the course of the year. And that's the benefit of electronic reporting more frequently.
Okay, that makes sense. And then say the walleye and the salmon, there are you said they're now a fish limit, not a pound limit, I guess.
That's so for the subsistence fishery in Little Beta there's a number of fish limit, and that fishery is almost exclusively walleye because it's near shore. It's in the springtime when walleye are near shore for spawning.
But the commercial side, I mean, they're bycatch. They have limits on.
So let's talk about that for a second. So we'll talk about walleye and perch because that's the other species where there's some changes. So the walleye and perch regulations are a little bit different in the 2023 decree compared to what they were in the 2000 consent decree. In the 2000 consent decree, the regulations for those two species differed by grid. The Great Lakes is broken up into different grids, so it's kind of a small areas. Charter captains are familiar with those. They have to report grids. Commercial fishers have to report by grid. So the challenge there was that in one grid, you might have a 15-pound limit for walleye. In the grid right next to it, there may be no limit at all per day for walleye. So if a fisher has to know exactly what grid they're in, and law enforcement it's really challenging
They
for
want to know
enforcement
exactly
side.
which grid they caught them in.
Right. So that's why in this new decree, we don't have a grid-based approach to retention for walleye and for yellow perch. Most areas of the lakes now will be open to walleye and yellow perch retention. The regulation that is now in the decree is a spawning closure. So during the periods when walleye and perch are spawning in different lakes, the commercial fishery is going to be closed. There's just a very small daily amount that can be retained if it's caught as bycatch during that closure. So for more open fisheries per se, for walleye and perch, there's now a spawning closure that's in the decree. But the regulations now are easier to understand for fishers, and it's more enforceable for law enforcement.
So what was the retention limit, or is that
Wait, now or then?
now?
Now there is no daily retention limit now for walleye or perch, but there are some areas where they cannot be retained.
Okay.
So in southern Lake Michigan, MM67, that's kind of the area from Arcadia south, they cannot be pursued. In Big Bay to Knock, they cannot be pursued. There's some nuance there to those depth restrictions that we talked about earlier, that if some are caught, they could still be retained, but they can't be actively pursued. And same thing for yellow perch. In MH2, the southern part of Lake Huron, the treaty waters from Rogers City to Alpena, they can only be retained in the fall after October 1st. And the changes for walleye in the northern part of Lake Michigan is there will be a limited amount of retention in Big Bay to Knock because of the gill net opportunity there. And the rest of northern Lake Michigan, from the bridge over to, until you get to Big Bay to Knock, there's no changes in the regulations. That area was open to without a daily limit in the 2000 consent decree, and that is the same case now. But now there will be a spawning closure that is officially in the decree itself. The consent decree is full of information, and we can sit here and I can rattle off details to you, because I personally have been working on this since we started this. The state began work on this new document in 2014, and I sat in the very first meeting where we started talking about, okay, we're going to be transitioning towards negotiating a new agreement. What do we need to do? What do we need to know? Fall of 2014, our division chief at the time, Jim Dexter, sent a letter to all of our constituents saying, what do you want to see? What do you like about the 2000 consent decree? What are some changes that you would like to see? And we gathered that feedback, and that was the basis of our internal discussions for 3 to 4 years as we were preparing what we would like to see. And the tribes did the same thing, and the federal government presumably did the same thing. And you start there, and then you end up with a very long, very detailed, very nuanced court document that's a challenge for the public to read. But the benefit is, if someone has questions, call me. That's the thing. If someone has questions, it's hard to understand. Of course, lawyers wrote it, and judges signed off on it, and it's nuanced. It covers a huge area of Michigan, and nobody should be expected to fully understand all of that. So if there's any questions, anything that comes up, what about this, what about that, context, I'm happy to answer those questions.
Great. Because it is complex, but I think it's also very interesting. I mean, we live in a very unique area. I mean, geographically. I mean, we have the Great Lakes, and just all the behind the scenes of how this is managed, and to make sure that these fisheries, continue on. And I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into all that.
There is, and I think it's also important for people to really take one step back and understand that the state of Michigan does not have sole authority to manage the resources in these treaty waters. Like, we are co-equals with tribal governments. They are sovereign governments. They are co-managers of this resource. So just because the state would like to do something or see something, we don't just say, yes, make it so. It doesn't work that way. We have to work together. There's give and take. We share the goal of wanting sustainable resources for generations to come, but how we do that and how we pursue the share of the resource that we want to use in a certain way, that's different, and that takes compromise.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for
Yeah.
helping. I mean,
You're
I do
welcome.
understand a little bit better
Yeah.
now. Like I said,
Yeah.
I looked at, I skimmed over, I was like, that's all, it's gibberish to me as somebody that's never read a
Right.
decree before or,
Yep.
looked at the rules regarding any of the commercial netting whatsoever. So,
It is super challenging. There's so much nuance to it. And, when this first came out in December of 22, it was all I did from the day it came out until I finally shut everything off for Christmas was talk to people.
Right.
Because, negotiations happen under a confidentiality agreement.
Okay.
Because if the proposals that were floated back and forth between the tribes and the state and the federal government were debated in public, I mean, with today's world, the way things are, we would never get anywhere.
Right.
So the only way we can get to yes is to have that trust of the parties in negotiations that we can freely say, this is what we're looking for, this is why we're looking for it. And everybody can do that, so we can try to piece together something that will work, that everybody can say yes to. Not yes, we love it, but yes, we will live with it.
Yeah.
And
Because not everyone's going to love
not everybody's going to love everything. And there's a difference between yes, fully endorse, and yes, I will live with this. And because all of that happened under the confidentiality agreement, and because this took so long, because of a global pandemic and because of the changes to the Great Lakes made it more challenging, nobody knew anything from when we started negotiations in the fall of 19 to when the document dropped in December of 22. And that's a challenge. And so understandably, people had questions and people didn't understand certain things because those of us that were in the room, we kind of saw the progression, and things that had been discussed and decided years in advance still never saw the light of day until December of 22. So it's a challenge when people first see it and digest it, and it takes time to understand the nuances and the differences. And that's what we're here for, is to have those conversations and to help kind of flesh out some of those questions and context for people.
And so this is in effect like right now, today, now after
That's
it's
something
signed.
else we should talk about. I'm
Yes.
glad you brought that up. So when Judge Maloney signed his order that implemented the decree, it did have immediate effect that this is now the decree that we are living under. So everything that was a part of the 2000 consent decree is now history in the past, and this is the new kind of set of governing framework regulations. The state and the federal government and the tribes are meeting right now as we speak. We're kind of talking through the challenges of moving from what was the 2000 consent decree to now some of these changes in the 23 decree. Nobody knew when the judge was going to rule. Nobody knew for sure what he was going to rule.
Right.
And so, while nobody was caught off guard, we just didn't know kind of the nuance of when this all would take effect. So the tribes are in the process of updating their regulations because their regulations have to reflect what is in the decree, just like the state's regulations have to reflect what is in the decree to make sure that we're in compliance with that court order.
Right.
And that process takes some time.
Okay.
So as of today, September 17th, that process is still ongoing. So when we have a little more certainty as to when we might see changes on the water, the state intends to send out a news release to let everybody know that this is kind of what we're expecting. At this point, I love certainties, but we just don't have those. And so after a 3-year negotiation process and a 9-month court process, it's not tremendously surprising that there's still a few wrinkles that need to be ironed out, but those will get ironed out hopefully in the coming weeks, coming month. But we're quickly nearing the end of the 2023 fishing season, and we do expect that in 2024 this would certainly be fully operational, if not maybe slightly before that.
Okay, good to know. I don't want people assuming, that it's in effect right now.
Right. Yep.
So how long does this 2023 decree last? Is it 20 years?
This one is in effect for 24 years.
24 years.
Yeah, and that was, again, something else that was the product of negotiation.
Okay.
So in this decree, some of the harvest limit cycles and some of the review periods for different things are on multiples of 3 or 6. And so that's why we ended up with 24 years, as it was a nice multiple of 3 that fit in with what the parties were looking for.
Makes sense. I think that covers a lot.
It does.
It's a lot of information to digest, but yes, thank you for helping to clarify a lot of that and to just, keep the public informed.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.